The very first thing I want to get into actually will be the main event, which was Dricus du Plessis and Israel Adesanya. So this was an intense middleweight fight, and obviously Dricus came out with the victory over Izzy. It was a back and forth event. The funny thing that I think a lot of us recognize is that Dricus is the real deal. He is legit. There's a match I want to talk about here in a second, but when we go into this fight, this was Izzy's in a sort comeback, and a lot of people, including myself, was already a little bit skeptical of him getting the rematch or a championship fight right away. That's what happened to occur, though, and he's earned it overall because of his career or whatnot. But I thought the rematch with Strickland should have happened instead of this one. But this is what went down. And the funny thing we learned about Dricus, though, is when we talk about the way he fights, it's such a unique style. He doesn't dominate in any way, shape, or form one specific skill. It's a combination. And on top of that, I think we all learned that he gasses out, or at least it appears he gasses out very, very quickly, but he fights the same way regardless of when that time occurs. It's this consistent way that he fights. It's a very challenging for him, but we were looking at this fight, and they were going back and forth, but there was a certain point when, it felt like Izzy maybe was getting something going. But Dricus decides to come out really quickly, and he hits Izzy with a couple shots, and Izzy decides he wants to, fight right then. He does the little knockoff Max Holloway in a sense. And in that moment, then just a few moments later, he is submitted by rear naked chokehold. So, it was a very interesting fight. Dricus officially, he cemented himself, though, as that guy. He is a legitimate star, and he deserves to be considered in that same category as one of the elites now. And, that was obviously an interesting fight there. But here's what I will say. What was intriguing to me was, a lot of people had rumors and speculations out there that, maybe this was a chance that following the fight that Izzy would have retired, especially if he would have won. And yet Izzy came back and said, he's not done yet. And that leads me to wonder, though, what is next for Izzy? He's the first bout Hall of Famer. He's one of the biggest fan favorite fighters of all time. He has an incredible resume. What else is there for him to do? Because he said he's not going to, we're not going to see him very soon. Might not be 3 months or so, but what are we waiting for? Is regardless of what happens, it's not going to be or shouldn't be for a championship fight. So he's going to have to work his way up to some extent. And you've really got a lot of guys already in line. The guy I'm going to talk about in a second now, Sean Strickland's up next. And after that, the winner of the Robert Whittaker Khamzat fight, should probably be the guy right after that to fight the winner of Strickland and du Plessis. So we've got a lot of guys moving in pieces here. I'm not sure who you really would even go after and fight that would make sense, right? Because you're not just going to give Izzy a nobody per se to fight. So that's where things get really interesting for him. If he decides to walk away, I think a lot of people would understand that. And it would make sense to a certain extent. But if he wants to continue fighting, it'd be great. I just hope that he preserves himself and he doesn't turn into something where he takes unnecessary hits and stuff very similar to what we're seeing in Tony Ferguson now. And so that's something that would be interesting. Now, after Izzy, though, I want to, of course, talk about the champion. Dricus du Plessis has now got the opportunity to do a couple of different things. We've heard throughout the week, and I addressed this on the Thursday show, that the plan in place was for him to do the rematch against Sean Strickland, or originally was Dana White said, the winner of that fight was going to fight Strickland. Now that we know the winner, obviously I'm putting those two pieces together, which that's the thing that should happen. I do believe that when you go back and rewatch that fight, that Strickland won that fight. Therefore, we'd be in a much different situation in terms of everything going on, what just happened this past weekend or even early in the year and so on and so forth regarding this fight. And so I personally do hope that we see Strickland and du Plessis. However, there was an interesting thing that came from that night that made me think a little bit. We saw Alex Pereira announce or I should say hint at a possible going back down to the middleweight division and fighting Dricus now and getting that belt back. Now, that would be something that would be very interesting to watch. I, of course, will say that I have to admit Pereira would win that fight. However, it would be intriguing to watch, to say the least. What I hope would happen, though, is this. Because we have something that I'm going to talk about also in a second, that Pereira is now booked, we know his next fight. Now, they could change that, of course, whatever. But most likely, we do know his next fight. I would like to see Strickland fight Dricus, by the end of the year. We're currently sitting in August, end of August per se. Is that something we could get on the December card? Is that something or do we have to wait for the very first, UFC event in January or whatever the case may be? Early next year, I should say 2025. But what I would like to say would be hopefully Dricus can get together and he's not too badly injured. We can see him back in this year, get that fight up and over with. And from that standpoint, then we can address who else is going to go from there. Because if Strickland beats Dricus, then obviously it's going to be an opportunity where, the Pereira fight doesn't make any sense any longer because we already know what Pereira over Strickland looks like. Not very pretty. So it's going to be an interesting, lots of moving pieces here, but I do hope we stick to the plan that was put in place where we see Strickland fighting Dricus du Plessis. By the end of this year, preferably would be my situation, my preference here. And in that rematch, I would say I think Strickland wins. I think that his style is tough to fight. Obviously, Dricus did come out, according to the judges, in the last one. If that occurs again, then so be it. However, I just don't see a situation in which, I don't think Dricus is better than Sean Strickland, in all honesty. Is he more entertaining? Maybe you could say that. But I think Strickland gets the win and will defeat Dricus du Plessis in the rematch. Next up on that was the co-main event. Kai Kara-France for Steve Erceg. In the flyweight division, this was a fight that went down, and it didn't last very long. It was at round 1, and we see the powerful punch by Kai Kara-France. And, he certainly made a statement. It stinks for Steve Erceg. I know I respect the guy. He's a good fighter. He's a good guy. Was not his night. It was a knockout hit. And, there was no way he's going to recover from that hit. But for Kai Kara-France, he's officially submitted himself and put himself in prime position now. He's amongst the top guys now in the flyweight division. Is it a title fight next? Is it an eliminator fight? Whatever the case may be, he's certainly up in that group now, and he made a big statement that night. Number 3 fight I've got to get into, and I was going to start off and go up from 3-1. However, I figured why not start with the fight of the night. Dan Hooker put on an absolute clinic. Now, that was an entertaining fight, I should say. It wasn't necessarily a clinic in terms of skill, more so meant that in the aspect of entertainment. That was a fight against Gamrot, which I don't think a lot of people expected from Hooker completely. I say that because there was so much hype building up for so many years of Dan Hooker, and then he had the in a sense you could say career come apart and lost a few losses. But now he's in a position where Dan Hooker has reinvented himself to a certain extent, got over the hump of where he was for a long time, has now come back and has had a winning streak. He's won 3 in a row. He's now moved to number 5 in the lightweight rankings. He's in prime position to have a big move. And that's really what I want to get into today with him, because that was a fight that went the distance. It had a split decision, but it's hard not to say that was obviously rightfully so the fight of the night. It was an entertaining fight, a good fight, and a lot of people earned a lot of great respect for Dan Hooker that night, as he should have. So he climbed his rankings up now, and you put him in position now where what's next? You know that you have a star in him. I know he's a beloved fighter. And so for Dana White, you have a chance to make a big fight. And what we heard rumors of now, and I can't say this was official, I know this is what we said, Hunter Campbell, he was the one that went and talked supposedly and suggested this idea, is that Dan Hooker, Charles Oliveira. That's a fight that I think would be box office. A lot of people might look at that and it would be interesting. Dan Hooker just works his way back up, but I think we would all be for that. That would be an incredible fight to watch. It would be a box office type fight to watch because both guys obviously have obviously Oliveira, I'm not going to compare Hooker to his fan base and the love that people have for Charles, but overall, what Dan Hooker did the other night earned him a ton of respect. People love him, and that would be an entertaining fight to say the least. So that's your breakdown of UFC 305. And now we're in a position where we're going to start getting ready for UFC 306 at the Sphere. We all know how much Dana White has hyped this up. We're a few weeks out now to be able to see if this really will go down as one of, if not the greatest combat event ever put together, as Dana White likes to say. But I want to break down now what we have heard from some other components of the UFC. And I want to go down the rankings. They just came out now, and I'm going to put this up on the screen for you guys to see the new updated top 15. I also want to shout out Championships Rounds for the graphic in which I'm utilizing. They obviously were the ones that made this, so I want to put this up here on the screen and give you guys the top 15 guys in the UFC pound-for-pound rankings. At number 15, Izzy Adesanya. He follows to 15. Charles Oliveira. Then you have Sean Strickland. You have Pantoja. You have Max Holloway. Tom Aspinall. Volkanovski. Leon Edwards is at number 8. Sean O'Malley. Du Plessis. Muhammad. Tupora. Jones, Pereira, and Islam is rounding out at number 1. So we had quite a bit of movement after this past weekend. Not a ton overall. Obviously, Du Plessis was the biggest jump, moving up 5 spots to number 6. But we look at this group, and obviously I just said a couple minutes ago, we look at what we have right there. Du Plessis, Sean Strickland, that's the fight that needs to happen next. I think we all want to see that, and that would be incredible to watch. But that is your new updated top 15 pound for pound rankings for the UFC as we stand at the moment. So I also now want to transition now into, that's overall what we're going to talk about for UFC. There's a couple of things I'm going to talk about when we get to the news section, but I do want to break down another component to what we've been looking at now with the boxing situation from this past weekend. I said before, it was not going to be the biggest boxing weekend we've ever seen before. It was a good boxing weekend, no, to say the least, but it wasn't the biggest event ever. But I do want to get into it, so it won't be too long here. And I want to break down the Christian Mbilli fight. There's actually two guys I'm going to discuss from this weekend. The first one will be Christian Mbilli. And I want to say that because I want to say the biggest statement made for the last, in which I want to give a large talk about. So Christian Mbilli goes in and he fights Sergey Derevyanchenko. And let me just say this. I tweeted about this fight. Brutal fight. This was a fight that as watching fighters, you don't want them to ever throw in the towel. At the same time, there's a time where your corner probably needs to step up. And I felt this was the fight that had that should have occurred. However, for Derevyanchenko, he's had such an incredible career, a long career. This was probably going to be his last chance at ever getting to a championship. This was a critical fight for him. I can see why he wanted to go out on a shield. But this was a tough fight. This was brutal. There's some fights that you watch that just, it's not good. And that's what we had here. It went the distance, which was shocking to watch, to say the least, because this was a brutal fight. But what I will say is that he had a warrior mindset in there, to say the least. There's no other way to put it. You're talking about a guy who, I don't believe it's been confirmed to this point yet, but I think it's pretty obvious. He tore his bicep early in the fight. I believe it was the end of round 3 or 4. Then going forward, he fights with literally one hand. He does try utilizing that hand a little bit, but it was fighting with one hand for the majority of the fight. He was already taking a beating up to that point. Going forward from that aspect, it was not a pretty fight. Now, he did win round 5, and I think he was challenging in round 6, and then Mbilli finished him off pretty good in round 6, so I actually gave Mbilli the round there. I believe it was round 6 or 5, but it was a tough fight. However, what a performance by him just to be able to thug it out, get that, to go the distance was impressive. I don't think anybody expected that. Most people expected and thought they should have thrown the towel in. He let him live another day. But, he went out on a shield. Will we see Derevyanchenko again? I don't know, because he obviously, does he want to go out like that? Probably not. But he has a great career. He's secured a lot of big fights in his life. He's not going to be able to go back to a championship opportunity, most likely. So this might have been the ending of that. However, I do want to talk about Christian Mbilli. There's two sides of this. He's now sitting in a position where he's 28-0. And, a lot of people I saw on Twitter were saying, or on X were saying, well, Christian Mbilli, he didn't get him knocked out. How do you not knock out a guy with one arm? Well, anybody that watched that fight is well aware that what Derevyanchenko was doing in that fight was clearly beyond what most people expected, right? A lot of people were not expecting him to be able to stay up that long. And he fought through that. And incredible grit, determination, and fashion. So I'm not going to put much of a blame on the fact they didn't get him KO'd and knocked him out there, but I do like his ability. Would I say that I walk away from that performance more excited about Mbilli than I was on Thursday? No. Would I say that I think he's a better fighter now than I would have said on Thursday? No. Do I think Mbilli is still a guy that's heavily on the rise, that's underrated to even a certain extent, and I would like to see him in a bigger fight and get a championship belt potentially? Absolutely. I think he's that good of a guy as a fighter, and I think there's a lot of big opportunities for him. And so I do think he's a very underrated fighter, and I think that he deserves that chance at a championship fight. That leads me to the point then, what's next for him? Because we know that 3 of the belts are now tied up by Canelo. One just got opened up, and obviously you were right to the big one. Is Canelo the guy to go fight? After that performance on Saturday, I don't think that's a good fight. I don't think you can market that well. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. He obviously also, I think his skill set and the way he fights plays right into Canelo. And so I'm not a big fan of that matchup today, or the next fight, I should say. So that could happen. It's possible, but Canelo's kind of in his own world doing what he wants to do at this point in time. And I don't know if that fight even makes sense to begin with. So then I shift my focus now, and you've got 2 guys that I really do like. First of all, Caleb Plant, and both these guys I'm going to say have already got fights scheduled next, but obviously they're coming up in the near future. So there's 2 fights. Caleb Plant, I love that fight. I think that would be very appealing and interesting. And Jaime Munguia, I would also like to see that fight occur as well. Both of those fights are very entertaining fights that I think would be interesting to see the outcome of. You could also see Diego Pacheco. He's another guy I could possibly see be interesting to see him fight Christian Mbilli. But those are ultimately the kind of guys that I'm kind of keying in on that I would hope and like to see Christian Mbilli fight. But I do think he is an underrated fighter. I think he's a good fighter, and I would love to see what he's got next. So it's going to be interesting to see what the next fight is, but he's a legit fighter. Not more impressed than I was on Thursday. However, I'm still very high on him, probably more high than I see a lot of people on him. I think he's got a lot of game. I think he deserves to be a champion and will be a champion in the future. All right. I saved one thing for last. That's Abdullah Mason. Let me just give a little intro here. Abdullah Mason, he is now 15-0. He has fought 4 times in 2024, all of them by KO. He has got another KO this past weekend in round 2 at the 40-second mark. This guy is only 20 years old, and he is 15-0. Is there even a debate for him really not being the best prospect in boxing right now? Listen, I know there's a lot of good guys out there, and not only America, but throughout the world that are, young and prospects working their way up. But you just talk about resume, you talk about production, you talk about what he's done, you talk about the level he's fighting at right now. I don't see anybody else really fighting at this level. Abdullah Mason is legit. He's the truth. He's going to be a superstar. It's not even a matter of if, it's a matter of when he officially takes that next jump and becomes a true household superstar in the boxing game. There's not much to dispute or debate here. He is the best boxing prospect currently, and he's the guy that you look at right now. And the only question I'm asking is how quickly should he step up? At the end of the day, he is 20 years old, right? So that is he's a young guy in a grown man sport. You don't play boxing, you box. So that's something that you have to be concerned about. Throwing up against the top tier guys right now probably doesn't make a lot of sense, being the fact that he is 20. So you do want to make sure that you build him up the right way, get him to the point where he's fighting other good guys, but it's not too early yet. I think he's very talented, but it's obviously there's a gap between a grown man and a 20-year-old. So that's the only aspect that I'm looking at. It has nothing to do with skill. It just happens to go based around the power aspect and what you're capable of as a 20-year-old fighting grown men. But it's not, like I said, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. They should build this resume up in the right way, get his body acclimated to each and every single level, continue to grow in fights, and do what he's doing right now. But all I will say is that there is going to be a day in the next not too distant future in which we will be talking about Abdullah Mason as one of the top pound for pound fighters in the world. He is that good. He is going to be the face of American boxing one day. He's going to be one of the top faces of boxing out there eventually. He is a special fighter, and I think we should be excited to watch him. He's got a guy that all of us Americans should be, like I said, we know he's going to be legit. Just let him work his way up the right way and naturally, and we'll be able to watch him grow into becoming a household boxer in the not too distant future. So he is legit. He made a statement once again in his 4th fight of 2024, all by KOs. He is the real deal. No ifs, ands, or buts about that. Abdullah Mason is the real deal.